Hello, so I'm gonna explore some ideas to the question. Symbols are the only meaningful way of talking about God. I feel like I need to remember everything I've learned for the exams in like a few months, so it's stressing out a little bit. But it'll be okay, yeah, it's just about revising a lot, isn't it? So I'll try and do some symbolism revision now and just see exactly what I can recall from my head. I've got the question wrote down next to me. Symbols are the only meaningful way of talking about God. Okay, so I think the key point in this question, or the key word, is only. So I think the way I would go about answering it would be to explore ideas, to explore other ways of approaching talking about God. Uh, and then if we're able to verify those other ways as either true or false, then that's going to help us conclude the question, which is symbols are the only meaningful way of talking about God, and that's because if we can find other meaningful ways of talking about God, then symbols aren't the only meaningful way of talking about God. But if we can't find other meaningful ways, then symbols are the only meaningful way of talking about God. Okay, so we'll start off by defining, I guess, the terms and stuff. Or introducing key thinkers. So Paul Tillich said that the only meaningful way we can talk about God was through the use of symbolism. When talking about symbolism, well, Paul Tillich, he distinguishes between symbols and signs, saying that a symbol is representative of something, whereas a sign points to something in the distance. So yeah, I'll just try to think of an example. If you're driving along the road and you see I don't know, there's a road sign which says uh what sort of road signs are there? There's a road sign for a junction. That's suggesting to you that there's going to be a junction up ahead, but it's not. The sign isn't actually the junction itself. It's just something pointing to something which is about to happen in the future. Whereas a symbol is a representation of something. For example, um the McDonald's M is a symbol and not a sign. It represents what McDonald's stands for. Um, but it's also important to note that it's not actually McDonald's. Like you wouldn't mistaken the symbol itself as McDonald's. You would just say, well, it encompasses all the things that McDonald's encompasses. It holds the connotations and it tells us something about McDonald's, but it's not exactly McDonald's. It's just a representation of what McDonald's stands for. So when we talk about symbols and God, what do we mean? Like a symbol can be it can be words or it can be pictorial. So linguistic or pictorial. Examples of linguistic symbols are prevalent within the Bible and religious scripture. For example, saying I think this is the case anyway. It's saying like a form of symbolic language is to say that the Lord is my shepherd, which is a line from the Bible, I believe. And it's not saying that the Lord is literally a shepherd. Shepherd. It's using symbolic language to say that the Lord is a shepherd. So um, there's people outside. So in order to be able to know exactly what this means, we have to look at the context of the time of which um and why the word shepherd would be used to describe God. And well, if we think about what a shepherd does, a shepherd looks after his sheep. Um, he takes care of people. So I guess you could say, well, is it suggesting that he's a protector almost? Um, yeah, I think we can compare this to the parable of the sheep and the goats, which also I think this actually might be from the parable of sheep and goats, but I'm not sure. He the Bible compares the shepherd to God and to the sheep and the goats to good and bad people. The good people go to um heaven, who were the sheep, the people who helped people throughout their lives, and the bad people who didn't help people, they don't go to heaven. And obviously it's not talking about literally sending sheep to heaven and goats to hell. That's not what it's saying. It's using symbolic language or I guess you could call it analogical. I don't think there's much difference between symbolism and analogical language, which is what Aquinas talked about. But I'm guessing there is some form of difference. Okay, well, what is analogy exactly? Because if we're gonna assume that analogy is different to symbolism, then that is going then that's going to change the conclusion that we come to. So Aquinas talked about analogy of proportion and analogy of attribution, and this is basically the idea that, well, we'll talk about analogy of attribution first. Aquinas said that when we use certain words to describe what God is, we have to know that it doesn't necessarily apply to God in the way that we understand the word, because God is he's a different sort of being. Like if you said that you're a good human, that's not the same as saying that Jinx is a good cat, because a cat and a human are different. Well, they're good in different sorts of ways. Like a good cat might be one who's competent at going out and catching mice, even though I might perceive that as being pretty evil. A good cat might be one who doesn't scratch me when I'm trying to go to sleep, or doesn't go around hitting things off the shelves. That would be good for a cat. But for a human to not do those things, that would be a good human, but it's not something that you would initially think of as being a good human. Perhaps being a good human means that you go out and you help people, or you go out of your way to do things, or I don't know, or you don't kill people, and you don't do all of these things which are considered to be moral for human beings, or not moral for human beings to do. So if we can understand this idea that goodness is relative to the species, then we have to also understand that what it means for God to be good isn't the same as what it means for us to be good. So we sort of have to well, I guess it's to do with the language that we use. We have to assume that our language isn't necessarily competent at describing God. And Aquinas actually said that we can know that God is, but we can't know what God is. And he was opposed to the idea of putting a definition on God due to our inferior language, and it just can't necessarily do God justice. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about analogy of attribution, but analogy of proportion was another one of Aquinas' ideas, which is pretty much linked to the other one, except well, because we're made in God's image, we have some of God's attributes. Therefore, we can sort of get a taste of what it means for God to be good. We can assume that God's goodness isn't too dissimilar to our own, but we have to assume that it's to a much greater degree of goodness that God has. However, understanding exactly what this degree is, we don't know. We don't know how disproportionately good we are to God. But we do know that God is much better than us at being good. So we can sort of understand what it means for God to be good. But I guess the question is, like, trying to link this back to symbolism. Symbols are the only meaningful way of talking about God. Is analogical language symbolic? I wouldn't say it is. Analogical language or the way of analogy isn't necessarily symbolic, because a symbol is like an image which is representative of something else. Whereas analogy is more of a comparison between two things, but it's not the thing. Or it's analogy is a comparison, whereas a symbol is a representation. When you say God is good, that's not a representation of God. I don't know, this is quite hard to get my head around. I'm just trying to distinguish the difference between analogy and symbolism and their use in talking about God. Well, let's assume that analogy is different to symbolism as a different means of talking about God to symbolism. Then we can conclude that symbolism isn't the only meaningful way of talking about God, because you can meaningfully talk about God by way of analogy. But then I guess we can link this to logical positivism, and they say that any statement which isn't verifiable is meaningless. Therefore, all religious language is meaningless. And so we can't talk about God in a meaningful way. So they would reject the idea that symbols are the only meaningful way of talking about God, because there is no meaningful way of talking about God. But we can link this to the verification principle, which is okay. So when our language aligns with the objects in the outside world, then the statement is true. When our language doesn't align with the objects in the outside world, then our language is false. But if we can't test whether our language is aligned with the external world, then our statement is meaningless. And obviously, because we can't prove or disprove God, then our language is meaningless. Therefore, symbolism isn't a meaningful way of talking about God at all. But I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if that would be an important thing to really capitalize upon, because the question is, symbols are the only meaningful way of talking about God. So I guess the question almost pushes the idea that we just have to make the assumption that God exists almost, or we have to make the assumption that we can talk about God in certain ways, and we just have to look at the different ways in which we do talk about God, and then work out which is the best, or no, work out whether symbolism is the only meaningful way of doing it. Okay, so I've looked at analogy. We'd also look at the via negativa, which is another way of talking about God, and this is basically the idea that we can't say anything positive about God because we don't know what God is. Therefore, we can only talk about God in using negative language, and this doesn't mean talk about him in a bad way. It means talking about him by saying what he is not. For example, we can say God is immutable, God is invisible, God is impassible, God is infallible. So all of these things are saying what God is not, but it's not saying what he is. For example, so the cataphatic way, which is the via positiva, or talking about God with positive language, would be saying God is all-loving, God is all-powerful, God is all-knowing. So his classical attributes, that is the via positiva, or the cataphatic way, whereas the apophatic way says God, we can't know those things about God for certain, we just have to talk about God in negative language, because our language is not competent enough in order to be able to speak of a transcendent being. And Pseudo Dionysius talks about he makes a comparison with mystics and says that some of the people who have had the greatest religious experiences or the greatest mystical experiences have the least to say about God, and so this can basically support the idea of the via negativa. By talking about God with negative words, we're not pinning him down, we're not negating him with labels, and we can link that to Kierkegaard, who said something along the lines of that which labels negates. The idea that when you put a label on something, it almost pins it down, it traps it, or it reduces it down to something it's not. And it just sort of reminded me of Wittgenstein, where he says, earlier Wittgenstein and later Wittgenstein are two pretty much different people. Earlier Wittgenstein thought that we can use language clearly in order to be able to explain the world. Anything can be said clearly. Whereas later Wittgenstein said that recognises the ambiguity of language, and that we should show the fly the way out of the bottle, so we shouldn't define words too precisely. That language requires a context in order for it to have any meaning at all. So if we have this ambiguity in language, then we can't be so certain about what we're talking about defining God, because if we have struggle defining tangible things, or having regular conversations about trivial topics on in everyday life, then how can we expect our language to be adequate when we're trying to define some sort of transcendent being, which we sort of know through feeling, but it's difficult to pin labels on that, because most religious experiences are ineffable, and that's like the pseudo Dionysian idea of the mystics who have the least to say about God because they've had the deepest experiences of what God actually is. I guess we can link this to knowing God and knowing of God. Those who know of God might have a lot to say about God. These are probably the people who read the Bible, they've read the religious scriptures, they've been to church, they've been to religious teachings of many sorts, and they seem to have a good intellectual understanding of exactly what God is. But those who have had religious experiences, that they realise how ineffable this being actually is, and you can't really put you can't really put words to that. Okay, and we can link this to Aquinas because Aquinas, towards the end of his life, he actually had a religious experience, and he'd wrote a lot of books, and he was an extremely influential thinker in the religious community, and he said that everything I wrote is like straw to me. So that's extremely interesting because it also supports this idea that we can't put a definition on the transcendent, that because it's beyond words. I think the Weiernig, concluding from what I've just explored there, we can conclude that the Via Negativa is a meaningful way of talking about God. Therefore, symbolism isn't the only meaningful way of talking about God. However, I guess we could take this a little bit further and say, is it completely meaningful? Because if you're just saying everything God is not, then you're not really getting any closer to what God is. And also, to suggest that you know what God does not, you suggest that you have an idea of what God is. Otherwise, if you otherwise you would be at risk of saying that God is not something that he is if you did not know what he was, partially at least. How can you be so certain that the things you're putting on this being, like the fact that he's invisible and the fact that he's infallible, or impassible, how would you know these things? Like, you must have some sort of idea of what he is in order to be able to be certain about what he is not, if that makes sense. Yeah, and another key thinker on the apophatic way, or the Via Negativa, was Moses Maimonides, and he used an example of a ship, and he basically he went through he used it he took a ship, and he basically said all of the things that the ship is not. So he's like, well, the ship is not solid, meaning it has space inside it. The ship is not flat. It's not it's not made out of it's not natural. So he went through a big list of what the ship was not, and he was like, well, at the end he was like, so you can see that we clearly arrive at the idea of a ship, and he was saying, well, so this validates the Via Negativa almost. But because he'd already told us beforehand what he was trying to what the subject of his Via Negativa was, then would we have really arrived at a ship if we didn't necessarily know exactly what he was talking about in the first place? Or could we have easily arrived at a wardrobe or a coffin or some other object? And also, we can criticise this view and say, well, is it right to compare God to a ship? And many people would say no. No. I love cats. She's got sharp claws. Okay, so I think symbolism is probably a better way of... Okay, I think symbolism is probably a more meaningful way of talking about God than the Via Negativa, because the Via Negativa just takes us too close to atheism almost. It's like, the Via Negativa as a method in itself of talking about God, it doesn't seem to actually get us anywhere in saying what God is, or give us any real understanding about what God is. Therefore, it's just close to atheism. You could easily be describing nothing. Whereas with symbolism, we're almost able to relate to that in some ways by saying God is a father, God is a shepherd, or God is a king, because we have some ideas about what these things are, but we also have to recognize that when it says Father, it doesn't mean that God is some sort of anthropomorphic figure who actually tangibly exists. It's more like the things which are associated with being a father. For example, being a protector, being someone who raises us, being someone who gives us life, and these things, I guess, they're all much more relative to talking about God than saying all of the things that God is not. I think that the via negativa can work, but it only works when it's in relation to another theory, for example, the via positiva. So you have to give God some positive attributes in order for um talking about him to be meaningful at all. Like, imagine if we just had the via negativa and we never had any other means of talking about God. It wouldn't seem like we were making much progress in theology. It would just be like we're talking about this non-existent being. But by saying God is omnibenevolent or omnipotent or omniscient, and I know these are the classical attributes which have been refuted by Paul Tillich, actually, who said who who read who was reading Nietzsche in the trenches of World War One. I think he was a German, so he would have been a German soldier, and he came across the idea of the death of God in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and he basically set out to say, well, we need to find a way to revive God. So what he did was he assumed that it was the classical attributes of God which had died. So he said he changed the definition of God, and he said, well, perhaps God is being itself. And obviously this raises problems because what does it mean to be being itself? It's quite ambiguous, but yeah, I think it's a good definition. But does it relate to symbolism? And I think it must, because, well, to say something is okay. This is 21 minutes in, but I'll try and get somewhere with this. So, what exactly does it mean to be being itself? Like, I don't think there's much difference between being and existence. To say something, because for something to be, it must also be in existence. You can't be and not be in existence. But then that also raises questions: what exactly is existence, and what does it mean to exist? Because there's many different ways in which something can exist. For example, there's the noumenal world, which is the world outside of ourselves, the world which exists independently of our experience, and then there's the phenomenal world, which is essentially what we experience. It's everything that's within our domain of the five senses. But then there seems to be more to existence. For example, we're able to imagine things, and these things exist, but they exist on a different level of existence. So yeah, but I think I'm getting really off topic by exploring that. So symbols are the only meaningful way of talking about God. I'm going to say no, they're not, because I think the via positiva, along with the via negativa, along with analogical language, they're all different ways of getting to an understanding about God, and I don't think it's fair to say that symbols are the only meaningful way of talking about God, because people find meaning in lots of different ways of talking about God. But okay, so I guess then the question is the via positiva meaningful? Does it have meaning? Well, meaning could be subjective. If talking about God through the means of positive attributes has meaning to the individual, then is that a meaningful way of talking about God? Debatably, yes, because, well, isn't God isn't personal experience of God one of the most important things? So you can't really rule that out as being meaningless. And then I guess you could take a nihilistic perspective and say, well, nothing's meaningful anyway. Everything is meaningless, but, so that's one avenue I could explore. Yeah. But I think one of the important things is understanding that language is inadequate when describing God, and this was a view taken by Augustine, and Aquinas, and, well, the via negativa is essentially language, but positive language is inadequate at describing God, so this was a view from Moses Maimonides and Pseudo Dionysius. yeah, so I'm gonna say, okay, just for the sake of time, that symbols are not the only meaningful way of talking about God. However, they are an adequate way of talking about God. Um, yeah, because it almost bridges the gap between us and God. Like we have to say God is something. So by saying that God is a shepherd, we can look back to the context of which the shepherd um played in society, or the role that a shepherd played in society at the time of the scripture being written. Find out exactly what the shepherd did, and then we were able to make that comparison between a shepherd and God, and that allows us to have some sort of understanding rather than saying uh, God is all of these things that he is not, rather than saying God is all of these things that he is not, because of our inadequate language, and also by saying God, only talking about God with divine negativa, by saying um which is pretty much the same as what I just said. Anyway, I'm gonna cut that out there. So yeah. Oh. Okay. Thanks for watching.